And the sheer scale of it all just boggles the mind, doesn't it? It makes you wonder what other secrets are hidden beneath that glassy surface. Did you know that for over 70 years a secret about Lake Tahoe was meticulously guarded? A secret so profound, so potentially disruptive, that its revelation could have changed the very fabric of the region. We're not talking about the mob's rumored underwater dumping ground or some forgotten gold rush stash. This is something far stranger, something that challenges our understanding of the lake itself. For decades, a clandestine operation, shrouded in secrecy and fueled by scientific curiosity, played out on and beneath Lake Tahoe's pristine waters. An operation so sensitive, so politically charged that its details were kept under lock and key, accessible only to a select few. Imagine this: crystal clear water, reflecting the surrounding Sierra Nevada mountains like a mirror. Tourists flock to its shores, captivated by its beauty and tranquility. Boats glide across its surface, skiers carve through the fresh powder on the nearby slopes. But beneath the idyllic facade, a hidden world existed. A world of cutting-edge technology, groundbreaking research, and a secret so closely guarded that even the locals remained blissfully unaware. What was the secret? It wasn't a monster, though some might argue it was monstrous in its implications. It wasn't a lost city, though in a way it represented a lost opportunity. It was a project, a decades-long endeavor aimed at unraveling the mysteries of Lake Tahoe, but with a twist that involved not just understanding the lake, but potentially altering its very nature. The story begins in the post-war era, a time of unprecedented scientific advancement and unwavering optimism. The world was buzzing with new possibilities, and Lake Tahoe, with its unique characteristics and untapped potential, became a focal point for ambitious researchers. Driven by a desire to understand the lake's delicate ecosystem and protect it from the encroaching threats of development and pollution, a group of scientists embarked on a journey that would ultimately lead them down a path of secrecy and controversy. They weren't just interested in studying the lake, they were interested in controlling it, in manipulating its natural processes to ensure its long-term health and vitality. But their methods were unconventional, their experiments risky, and their motives perhaps not entirely altruistic. The early days of the project were marked by a flurry of activity. Scientists from various disciplines, limnologists, hydrologists, engineers, descended upon Lake Tahoe, armed with state-of-the-art equipment and a shared vision of a pristine future. They meticulously collected data, analyzed water samples, and conducted experiments, all under the watchful eyes of government officials and private benefactors. The research was groundbreaking, yielding valuable insights into the lake's unique properties and the threats it faced. But as the project progressed, a sense of unease began to creep in. The scientists started to delve deeper, pushing the boundaries of what was considered ethical and acceptable. They began to experiment with new technologies that had the potential to fundamentally alter the lake's ecosystem. The turning point came with the development of a revolutionary new technique for controlling algae growth. Algae, a natural component of any aquatic ecosystem, can become problematic when it proliferates excessively, leading to unsightly blooms and disrupting the delicate balance of the food web. The scientists believed they had found a way to selectively target and eliminate specific types of algae, without harming other organisms. But the technique was untested, and its long-term effects were unknown. Despite the risks, they pressed ahead, eager to demonstrate the potential of their technology. They started small, conducting controlled experiments in isolated areas of the lake. The results were promising, but also unsettling. The algae disappeared, as predicted, but other unexpected changes began to occur. The water clarity improved dramatically, but the fish populations dwindled. The delicate balance of the ecosystem was being disrupted, and the scientists realized they were playing with fire. The ethical dilemma they faced was immense. Should they continue their experiments, knowing that they could potentially harm the lake's ecosystem? Or should they abandon their research and risk allowing the lake to succumb to the threats of pollution and development? The decision was not an easy one, and it ultimately led to a deep division within the scientific community. Some argue that the potential benefits outweighed the risks, that the long-term health of the lake was worth sacrificing short-term stability. Others vehemently opposed the experiments, arguing that tampering with nature was a dangerous game and that the consequences could be catastrophic. The debate raged on behind closed doors, far from the public eye. And as the controversy intensified, the project became increasingly secretive. The scientists realized that if their work were to become public, it would likely be shut down immediately. The potential for public outcry was too great, the political risks too high. So they made a decision to keep their research hidden, to continue their experiments in secret, hoping that they could eventually find a way to mitigate the risks and achieve their ultimate goal, a pristine and healthy Lake Tahoe. This decision marked the beginning of the 70-year cover-up. A cover-up that involved not just the scientists themselves, but also government officials, private benefactors, and even some members of the local community. All sworn to secrecy, all bound by a shared belief that the ends justified the means. But as the years passed, the secret became increasingly difficult to maintain. Experiments continued, the risks grew, and the consequences became more and more apparent. And the weight of the cover-up began to take its toll on those who were involved. Whispers started to circulate, rumors began to spread, and some people started to ask questions. But the truth remained hidden, buried beneath layers of secrecy and deception. Until now. Because today we're going to pull back the curtain on this clandestine operation and reveal the depth secret they kept quiet for 70 years. We'll explore the science behind the experiments, the ethical dilemmas they faced, and the devastating consequences that ultimately unfolded. We'll uncover the truth about what really happened on and beneath Lake Tahoe's pristine waters, and examine the legacy of the secret project, a legacy that continued to shape the lake's ecosystem to this very day. So buckle up, because this is a story you won't soon forget. A story of ambition, secrecy, and the unforeseen consequences of playing God with nature. A story that begins with the best of intentions, but ends with a chilling reminder of the power and fragility of our natural world, and the secrets that lie hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed as we delve into the depths of Lake Tahoe's carefully guarded past. And as the decades rolled by, the kokanee thrived, maybe even a little too well. They became a staple of the Tahoe ecosystem, a vibrant flash of red in the clear blue depths. Fishermen flocked to the lake, eager to test their skills against these feisty, landlocked salmon. The local economy boomed, fueled by tourism and the promise of a bountiful catch. The Chamber of Commerce patted themselves on the back, declaring the kokanee introduction a resounding success. But beneath the surface, a more complex story was unfolding, a story that would take years to fully understand. See, introducing a new species into any environment is like playing a game of ecological Jenga. You pull one block out and you never quite know what's going to happen to the rest of the tower. In Lake Tahoe's case, the kokanee, while initially beneficial, began to exert a subtle but powerful influence on the lake's delicate balance. They competed with native fish for food, altering the food web in ways that scientists are still trying to fully grasp. The Mackinaw trout, also known as lake trout, which had long been the apex predator in Tahoe, found a new, readily available food source in the kokanee. This led to an increase in the Mackinaw population, which in turn put even more pressure on the native fish. And that wasn't all. The kokanee's feeding habits also had an impact on the lake's clarity, that crystal clear water that Tahoe is so famous for. They primarily feed on zooplankton, tiny creatures that graze on algae. By consuming vast quantities of zooplankton, the kokanee indirectly contributed to an increase in algae growth, potentially clouding the water and diminishing its pristine beauty. Now, this wasn't an immediate catastrophic change. It was a slow, gradual shift, almost imperceptible at first. But over time, the cumulative effect became noticeable, raising concerns among environmentalists and scientists. But here's the thing, nobody really wanted to talk about it. The kokanee were too popular, too economically important. Questioning their presence in Lake Tahoe was like questioning the very foundation of the local economy. So the concerns were often brushed aside, the potential risks downplayed. It was a classic case of short-term gains overshadowing long-term consequences. The allure of a thriving fishing industry and a booming tourism sector was simply too strong to resist, even if it meant potentially jeopardizing the lake's long-term health. And so, the secret was kept. Not necessarily out of malice, but out of a desire to maintain the status quo, to avoid rocking the boat, both literally and figuratively. But nature, as always, has a way of making its voice heard. The subtle changes in the lake's ecosystem continued, slowly but surely. The native fish populations dwindled, the algae blooms became more frequent, and the overall health of the lake began to show signs of stress. It became increasingly clear that the kokanee, while initially seen as a savior, were now contributing to a complex web of ecological challenges. And the question then became, what could be done about it? How could they undo the unintended consequences of their well-intentioned intervention? It was a question that would haunt the scientists and policymakers of Lake Tahoe for years to come. A question that continues to be debated and wrestled with to this day, as they grapple with the legacy of that fateful decision made over 70 years ago. A decision that forever altered the course of Lake Tahoe's natural history, leaving behind a tangled web of ecological complexities and unanswered questions, and a lingering sense of responsibility for the choices of the past. And the story doesn't end there. In fact, the introduction of the mysis shrimp was just the beginning of a cascade of ecological shifts that would ripple through the lake's ecosystem for decades. As the mysis population exploded, they began to consume vast quantities of zooplankton, the tiny organisms that form the base of the food chain. These zooplankton were a crucial food source for the native Lahontan cutthroat trout, a species that had already been struggling due to habitat loss and overfishing. The mysis shrimp, in effect, were competing directly with the trout for food, exacerbating the decline of the native fish population. Now, the scientists who had championed the introduction of the mysis shrimp found themselves in a difficult position. They had hoped to create a thriving sport fishery, but instead they had inadvertently disrupted the lake's delicate ecological balance. The very creatures they had introduced to solve one problem had created a whole host of new ones. We thought we were doing the right thing, Dr. Miller confessed years later in an interview. We genuinely believed that the mysis shrimp would provide a valuable food source for the trout and enhance the fishing experience. We never anticipated the devastating impact they would have on the zooplankton population and the native ecosystem. The decline of the Lahontan cutthroat trout was particularly alarming. These fish were once abundant in Lake Tahoe and its surrounding streams, but their numbers had dwindled dramatically over the years. The introduction of the mysis shrimp was just one more blow to a species already on the brink. It was heartbreaking to watch the trout population decline, said Sarah Johnson, a local conservationist who had dedicated her life to protecting Lake Tahoe's native species. These fish are a symbol of the lake's natural heritage, and their disappearance would be a tragic loss. As the mysis shrimp continued to thrive, they began to alter the lake's food web in other unexpected ways. The kokanee salmon, another species that had been introduced to Lake Tahoe, initially benefited from the presence of the mysis shrimp. The salmon fed on the shrimp, and their population grew for a time. However, this apparent success was short-lived. The mysis shrimp, it turned out, had a peculiar behavior. They migrated to the depths of the lake during the day and rose to the surface at night. This vertical migration pattern meant that the kokanee salmon, which typically fed during the day, had a limited window of opportunity to prey on the shrimp. Over time, the salmon population began to decline as well, as the mysis shrimp proved to be an unreliable food source. The changes in the food web also had a noticeable impact on the lake's clarity. The zooplankton that the mysis shrimp consumed played a vital role in controlling algae growth. By reducing the zooplankton population, the mysis shrimp indirectly contributed to an increase in algae blooms, which clouded the water and reduced its transparency. Lake Tahoe is famous for its exceptional clarity, explained Dr. Ramirez, a limnologist who had been studying the lake for over 2 decades. And the introduction of the mysis shrimp, while seemingly innocuous at the time, had a cascading effect that threatened to undermine that very quality. The irony, of course, was that the very thing intended to improve the fishing experience at Lake Tahoe was now threatening to degrade the lake's most prized possession, its pristine clarity. It was a classic example of unintended consequences, a cautionary tale about the delicate balance of ecosystems and the potential for human intervention to disrupt that balance. And it wasn't just the clarity that was at stake. The introduction of the mysis shrimp also had implications for the native fish populations of Lake Tahoe. The Lahontan cutthroat trout, for instance, a species that had already been struggling due to habitat loss and overfishing, now faced increased competition for food from the kokanee salmon, which were thriving thanks to the mysis shrimp. The Lahontan cutthroat trout is a native species that is uniquely adapted to the conditions of Lake Tahoe, explains Sarah Johnson, a fisheries biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Is a part of the lake's natural heritage, and we have a responsibility to protect it. But protecting the Lahontan cutthroat trout in the face of the changes wrought by the mysis shrimp was proving to be a difficult task. The kokanee salmon, with their abundant food source, was simply outcompeting the native trout. And the decline in the zooplankton population also meant that there was less food available for the young trout, making it harder for them to survive. As the ecological impacts of the mysis shrimp became increasingly apparent, a debate began to emerge about what, if anything, should be done to address the problem. Some argued that the best course of action was to simply let nature take its course, that the lake would eventually find a new equilibrium. Others argued that intervention was necessary, that the only way to restore the lake's clarity and protect its native species was to somehow reduce the mysis shrimp population. But how do you get rid of something that's already established itself in an ecosystem? It's not like you can just scoop them all out with a net. The mysis shrimp were small, numerous, and well adapted to the deep, cold waters of Lake Tahoe. Any attempt to control their population would have to be carefully considered and meticulously planned. One idea that was floated was to introduce a predator that would feed on the mysis shrimp. But this approach carried its own risks. Introducing a new species into an ecosystem can have unpredictable consequences, as the mysis shrimp themselves had demonstrated. What if the new predator also preyed on native species? What if it disrupted the food web in other unforeseen ways? Another idea was to try to physically remove the mysis shrimp from the lake. This could be done using specialized nets or traps, but the sheer scale of Lake Tahoe made this a daunting task. It would require a massive effort, and there was no guarantee that it would be effective. And then there was a question of cost. Any attempt to control the mysis shrimp population would be expensive. Who would pay for it? The federal government? The state government? Private donors? As the debate raged on, the mysis shrimp continued to thrive, and the clarity of Lake Tahoe continued to decline. The secret that had been kept quiet for so long was now out in the open, and everyone was grappling with the consequences. The story of the mysis shrimp serves as a valuable lesson about the complexities of ecological management and the importance of considering the potential consequences of our actions. The future of Lake Tahoe and its famed clarity hung precariously in the balance. The price tag was indeed staggering. Millions, perhaps tens of millions, would be needed to even attempt a large-scale mysis shrimp removal. The ecological consequences of that undertaking were, of course, another Pandora's box waiting to be opened. What would fill the void left by the shrimp? Would a new, even more detrimental species move in? The questions were endless, and the answers were far from clear. The Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, or TRPAO, found itself at the epicenter of this controversy. They were tasked with balancing the needs of the environment with the economic realities of the region. Hotels, restaurants, and businesses all depended on the allure of a pristine Lake Tahoe. A murky lake meant fewer tourists, fewer dollars, and a struggling local economy. One particularly heated town hall meeting captured the frustration and division within the community. "We need to act, and we need to act now," exclaimed a local business owner, his voice echoing through the crowded room. "My livelihood, my family's future depends on a clear lake. We can't just sit here and watch it turn into a swamp." An elderly woman, a long-time resident of Tahoe, stood up, her voice trembling slightly. "But at what cost?" she asked. "We can't just blindly throw money at this problem without understanding the potential consequences. We need to be careful, deliberate. This lake is a treasure, and we can't afford to make things worse." A scientist from UC Davis, who'd been studying the lake for decades, stepped up to the microphone. "The situation is complex," he admitted. "There is no easy solution. Removing the mysis shrimp might help restore clarity, but it could also disrupt the entire food web. We need more research, more data, before we can make any informed decisions." The debate continued late into the night, with no clear consensus in sight. The TRPA listened intently, taking notes, trying to navigate the treacherous waters of public opinion and scientific uncertainty. Meanwhile, beneath the surface of the lake, the mysis shrimp continued their relentless work, consuming the zooplankton that kept the algae in check. Each day the lake grew a little murkier, a little less vibrant. One evening, a group of concerned citizens gathered on the shore, watching the sunset paint the sky with hues of orange and purple. The beauty of the scene was undeniable, but a sense of unease hung in the air. "Do you remember how clear the lake used to be?" one of them asked, his voice filled with nostalgia. "You could see all the way to the bottom in some places." "Yeah," another replied. "My grandfather used to tell stories about diving for coins and seeing them sparkle on the lake floor." A young girl who had been listening quietly spoke up. "Will I ever get to see the lake like that?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Her question hung in the air, unanswered. The future of Lake Tahoe was uncertain, its fate resting on the shoulders of those who understood its delicate balance. The old-timers looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They knew that the lake was more than just a beautiful place. It was a living thing, and it was in trouble. They had seen the changes over the years, the slow but steady decline in clarity, the shift in the ecosystem. And they knew that something had to be done. For meanwhile, out on the lake, a research team was preparing for another dive. Dr. Emily Carter, a marine biologist who had dedicated her life to studying Lake Tahoe, adjusted her equipment. She was determined to uncover the truth about the lake's declining clarity. She had a hunch that the mysis shrimp were not the only culprit. Something else was at play, something deeper, something that had been hidden for decades. "All right, team, let's go over the plan one more time," she said, her voice clear and confident. "We'll be focusing on the areas near Emerald Bay today. I want to collect samples from the sediment and analyze them for any unusual pollutants or toxins." The team nodded in agreement. They knew that this was a crucial mission. The fate of Lake Tahoe might very well depend on their findings. As they descended into the depths, the sunlight faded and the water grew colder. The pressure increased, and the silence was broken only by the sound of their breathing apparatus. Dr. Carter reached the lake floor and began collecting samples. She noticed something strange. The sediment was darker than usual, and there was a faint odor of sulfur. She carefully sealed the samples and signaled to her team to ascend. Back on the boat, they began to analyze the samples. The results were shocking. They found traces of heavy metals and other pollutants that should not have been there. Where could this be coming from? One of the team members asked, his voice filled with concern. There's no industrial activity in the area. Dr. Carter frowned. That's what's so puzzling, she said. It's like the pollutants are coming from somewhere, deep within the lake itself. She remembered the stories she had heard about the old mines in the area. Could it be possible that there were underwater mine shafts leaking pollutants into the lake? It seemed far-fetched, but she couldn't rule it out. She decided to investigate further. She contacted the local historical society and asked them about the old mines. They told her that there were indeed several mines that had been abandoned decades ago. Some of them were said to be located near the lake shore, and it was possible that they extended underwater. Dr. Carter knew that she had to find out for sure. She organized another dive, this time with a specialized team of underwater explorers. They were equipped with sonar and underwater cameras. Their mission was to locate the old mine shafts and assess the extent of the pollution. As they explored the depths, they discovered a series of tunnels and shafts that led deep into the earth. The water was murky and filled with sediment. The team carefully navigated through the maze of tunnels, documenting their findings. They found evidence of heavy metal contamination in the water and sediment. The source was clear. The abandoned mines were leaking pollutants into the lake. Dr. Carter was shocked by the extent of the damage. The pollution was far worse than she had imagined. She knew that something had to be done to stop the leaks, but she didn't know how. The mines were located in a remote and inaccessible area. It would be a massive undertaking to seal them off. As she pondered the problem, she remembered the stories she had heard about the legendary Cousteau dives in Lake Tahoe. She wondered if Cousteau had ever encountered those mines. She decided to delve into the archives and see if she could find any information. After days of searching, she finally found something. A faded photograph of Cousteau and his team standing near a mine entrance on the lakeshore. The caption read, "Exploring the hidden depths of Lake Tahoe." Dr. Carter realized that Cousteau had known about the mines all along. But why hadn't he said anything? What was the reason for the secrecy? She felt a sense of unease. There was something more to this story than she realized. She decided to track down any surviving members of Cousteau's team and find out what they knew. The search led her to an elderly oceanographer living in France. He was reluctant to talk at first, but after some persuasion, he agreed to share his story. He told her that Cousteau had discovered the mines during his dives in Lake Tahoe. He'd been concerned about the pollution, but he had also been fascinated by the historical significance of the mines. He had believed that they were a valuable part of the lake's heritage and that they should be preserved. He had made a deal with the local authorities to keep the mines a secret in exchange for their promise to monitor the pollution. But the monitoring had never happened, and the pollution had continued unabated for decades. Dr. Carter was furious. Cousteau's silence had condemned Lake Tahoe to a slow and agonizing death. She knew that she had to expose the truth, no matter the consequences. She gathered her evidence and prepared to go public with her findings. But she knew that she would face opposition from powerful forces who wanted to keep the secret buried. The fate of Lake Tahoe hung in the balance. Would she be able to save it before it was too late? The files were meticulously organized, each document a damning indictment of corporate greed and governmental negligence. She reread Cousteau's letter, the elegant script now seeming like a cruel joke. "Preservation through silence," it read, "a temporary measure for the greater good." The greater good, she thought bitterly. For whom? Certainly not for the lake, not for the people who depended on it. She picked up the phone, her hand trembling slightly. She needed to contact the right people, people who wouldn't be intimidated by powerful interests. She dialed a number she hadn't used in years, the number of an old college friend, now a respected investigative journalist. "Sarah, it's Emily Carter," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "I have something you need to see, something big. It's about Lake Tahoe." There was a pause on the other end. "Tahoe? What about it? I thought it was all pristine and protected." "That's what they want you to think," Emily replied. "But it's a lie, a 70-year-old lie, and it's killing the lake." They arranged to meet the next day. Emily spent the rest of the night preparing, organizing the documents, anticipating the questions. She knew that once the story broke, all hell would break loose. But she was ready. She had to be. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Emily's cabin, her eyes wide with anticipation. Emily led her inside and laid out the evidence, the scientific reports, the internal memos, the photographs of the underwater dumping sites, and Cousteau's letter. Sarah spent hours poring over the documents, her expression growing increasingly grim. "This is unbelievable," she said finally. "This is a massive cover-up." "I know," Emily said, "and it's time it stopped." "But who's behind it?" Sarah asked. "Who would go to such lengths to hide this?" Emily hesitated. "That's the complicated part. It involves several corporations, a few government agencies, and, well, let's just say some very influential people." Sarah's eyes widened. "Influential people? You mean like politicians?" "Potentially," Emily said, carefully choosing her words. "The documents are heavily redacted, but there are patterns, connections, names that keep popping up. People who benefited directly from the industries that were polluting the lake." The weight of it all settled heavily on Sarah. This wasn't just about a few rusty barrels at the bottom of the lake anymore. This was about power, greed, and the willingness to sacrifice something as precious as Lake Tahoe for profit. "So, what do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We expose them," Emily said, her voice firm. "We bring the truth to light. The people deserve to know what's been happening to their lake." But Emily knew that exposing these powerful figures wouldn't be easy. They had resources, influence, and a vested interest in keeping the truth buried. They would fight back, and they would fight dirty. "It's going to be dangerous, Sarah," Emily warned. "We'll be making enemies. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Sarah looked at the photographs of the lake, at the crystal clear water and the majestic mountains surrounding it. She thought about the generations of people who had enjoyed its beauty and the generations to come who deserve to do the same. "I'm ready," Sarah said, her voice filled with determination. "We have to do this." Their first step was to gather more evidence. They needed to connect the dots to build an airtight case that would stand up to scrutiny. They started by reaching out to some of Emily's old contacts, people who had worked in the environmental field for years and had a deep understanding of Lake Tahoe's ecosystem. One of those contacts was a retired hydrologist named Dr. Thomas Ashton. He had spent his entire career studying the lake, and he had a wealth of knowledge about its history, its geology, and its delicate balance. "I've suspected something like this for years," Dr. Ashton said when Emily and Sarah showed him the documents. "There have always been anomalies, unexplained changes in the lake's chemistry, but I could never prove anything." Dr. Ashton agreed to help them, providing them with access to his research and his expertise. He also warned them about the potential dangers they faced. "These people are not going to take this lying down," he said. "They have a lot to lose. Be careful who you trust." As Emily and Sarah delved deeper into their investigation, they began to uncover a network of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and secret deals that all led back to the same group of individuals. They discovered that these individuals had been systematically polluting the lake for decades, dumping toxic waste, diverting water, and manipulating regulations to benefit their own bottom lines. The more they learned, the more outraged they became. They couldn't believe that anyone could be so callous, so greedy, so willing to destroy something so beautiful and so precious. But they also knew that they were getting closer to the truth. They could feel the pressure mounting, the sense that they were being watched. One evening, as they were working late in Emily's office, the lights suddenly went out. The room plunged into darkness, and they heard a noise outside the door. "Someone's here," Sarah whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. Emily grabbed a heavy wrench from her toolbox and held it in front of her. "Stay behind me," she said. The door slowly creaked open, and a shadowy figure stepped into the room. "Who's there?" Emily demanded, her voice trembling slightly. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it lunged forward, swinging a metal pipe. Emily reacted quickly, dodging the blow and swinging the wrench. The wrench connected with the figure's head, and the figure stumbled backward, collapsing to the floor. Emily and Sarah stood there, panting, staring at the unconscious figure on the floor. They had no idea who it was or why they were there. But they knew one thing for sure: they were in serious danger. This was no longer just about uncovering a secret. It was about survival, and they were going to have to fight to protect themselves and to protect the truth about Lake Tahoe. The stakes had been raised, and the game had just gotten a whole lot more dangerous. So they knew they had to figure out what to do, and fast, because the next time they might not be so lucky, and the fate of the lake and maybe even their own lives hung in the balance. "What do we do now?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the low hum emanating from the strange machinery that lined the walls of the cavern. Mark ran a hand through his hair, his eyes darting around the room, searching for any clue, any indication of what had transpired. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we can't just leave him here." He gestured towards the unconscious figure. "But what if he's one of them?" Emily countered, her voice laced with suspicion. "What if he's part of whatever's going on here?" "We can't just assume that," Mark replied. "He could be a victim, just like us. Besides," he added, kneeling down to examine the man, "he doesn't look like he's in great shape." The man was dressed in simple, worn clothing, a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the underground facility. His face was pale and gaunt, and there was a small cut on his forehead. "He needs help," Mark said, looking up at Sarah and Emily. "We have to get him out of here." Together, they carefully lifted the man and carried him towards the tunnel they'd entered through. The task was difficult. The man was heavier than he looked, and the uneven ground made their progress slow and arduous. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every sound made them jump. As they reached the entrance to the tunnel, they heard a noise behind them, a metallic clanging, growing louder with each passing second. "Someone's coming," Emily hissed. "We have to go." They quickened their pace, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had to get out of there before they were discovered. They hurried through the tunnel, stumbling and scraping their knees on the rough walls. The sound of pursuit grew louder, closer. Finally, they reached the end of the tunnel and emerged back into the boathouse. The sudden daylight was blinding, and they blinked, trying to adjust their eyes. "Quick, get him into the boat," Mark urged. They hauled the unconscious man into the small motorboat, and Mark started the engine. It sputtered to life, and he steered the boat away from the boathouse, back out onto the lake. As they sped across the water, they risked a glance back at the boathouse. A figure emerged from the shadows, standing on the dock, watching them. They couldn't make out any details, but they could feel the intensity of the gaze. "Who was that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Mark replied, "but I don't think they're happy we found this place." They continued to speed away from the boathouse, the figure on the dock growing smaller and smaller in the distance. The adrenaline began to wear off, replaced by a chilling fear. They had stumbled upon something far bigger and more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. They didn't speak for a while, each lost in their own thoughts, trying to process what they had just seen and experienced. The boat sliced through the water, the rhythmic hum of the engine a stark contrast to the chaotic thoughts swirling in their minds. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "So, what do we do now?" Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I honestly don't know. We have a bunch of fragmented files, a creepy encounter, and a feeling that we're way out of our depth." Emily, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. "We keep digging. We have to. This is too important to just ignore." "But what if we're putting ourselves in danger?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with concern. "We have to be careful, of course," Emily conceded. "But we can't let fear paralyze us. We've already come this far." Mark nodded in agreement. "Emily's right. We need to be smart about this. We can't just go barging in, guns blazing." They decided to head back to the cabin, where they could review the files in a more secure environment. As they approached the shore, they noticed a black SUV parked near their car. It wasn't there before. "That's not good," Mark muttered. They parked the boat and cautiously approached the SUV. As they got closer, a figure emerged from the driver's seat. It was a woman in a dark suit, her face obscured by sunglasses. "Can I help you?" Mark asked, trying to sound confident despite the knot of fear tightening in his stomach. The woman didn't respond. She simply reached into her jacket and pulled out a badge. "Federal agent," she said, her voice cold and professional. "I need to ask you a few questions about your activities on Lake Tahoe." Sarah and Mark exchanged nervous glances. This was it. They had been found out. "We were just doing some research," Emily said, stepping forward. We're historians. The agent raised an eyebrow. Is that so? And what kind of research requires you to break into private property? We didn't break into anything, Mark protested. The boathouse was unlocked. That's not how it was reported, the agent said, her voice hardening. Now I'm going to ask you again. What were you doing in that boathouse? They knew they couldn't lie their way out of this. They decided to tell her a carefully crafted version of the truth, omitting the more sensitive details about the conspiracy and the redacted files. They explained that they were researching the history of Lake Tahoe and had stumbled upon the boathouse, which they could believe contained historical documents. The agent listened intently, her expression unreadable. When they finished, she remained silent for a moment, her eyes scanning their faces. I'm going to need you to come with me to the station, she said finally. We have a few more questions for you. As they were being escorted to the SUV, Mark noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A figure was watching them from the woods, partially hidden behind a tree. It was the same person they had seen on the dock at the boathouse. The person was definitely watching them. It was clear that they were in deep trouble. This was far beyond a simple case of trespassing. They had stumbled upon something that someone or some group wanted to keep buried, and they were willing to go to great lengths to protect their secret. The agent ushered them into the SUV, and they were driven away, leaving the pristine beauty of Lake Tahoe behind, replaced by an uncertain and potentially dangerous future. The mystery of the lake deepened, pulling them further into its dark embrace. It was becoming increasingly clear that the secrets hidden beneath the surface were far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined, and that their quest for the truth had just taken a very perilous turn, and the depths held their breath, waiting to see what the next move would be. The SUV sped away from the lake, the towering pines blurring into streaks of green against the twilight sky. Sarah glanced at Ben, his face a mask of grim determination. The agent, a man who introduced himself only as Mr. Davis, sat silently in the front, his eyes fixed on the road. The air inside the vehicle was thick with unspoken tension. Where are you taking us? Ben finally asked, his voice tight. Mr. Davis didn't turn. To a safe location, somewhere we can talk without being overheard. Overheard by who? Sarah pressed, her anxiety growing with each mile they put between themselves and the lake. By those who wouldn't want you to know the truth about Lake Tahoe, Mr. Davis replied, cryptically. Let's just say there are powerful interests at play here. The drive continued in silence for what felt like hours. They eventually arrived at the secluded cabin nestled deep within the Sierra Nevada mountains. The cabin was rustic but well maintained, with a crackling fireplace providing the only source of light. Mr. Davis led them inside, his movements efficient and purposeful. Make yourselves comfortable, he said, gesturing to a worn leather couch. I'll explain everything, but first, I need to know how much you already know. Ben and Sarah exchanged a look. We know about the anomalous readings, Ben began. The strange energy signatures, the disappearances. We know that something isn't right about that lake. And you suspect it's connected to the Cold War? Mr. Davis asked, his eyes narrowing. It's the only thing that makes sense, Sarah replied. The timing, the secrecy. It all points to some kind of government project gone wrong. Mr. Davis nodded slowly. You're closer than you think. Lake Tahoe wasn't just a scenic vacation spot during the Cold War. It was a strategic location, chosen for its unique properties and its proximity to sensitive areas. He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. In the early 1950s, the government initiated a top-secret project codenamed Project Icarus. The goal was to develop a new type of sonar technology, one that could detect Soviet submarines lurking in the depths of the ocean. Lake Tahoe, with its extreme depth and unusually clear water, was the perfect testing ground. But what does that have to do with the disappearances? Ben asked, his brow furrowed. The sonar technology they were developing was unconventional, Mr. Davis said, choosing his words carefully. It didn't rely on sound waves in the traditional sense. It used something else, something esoteric. Esoteric? What do you mean? Sarah asked, her voice laced with skepticism. They were experimenting with manipulating the very fabric of reality, Mr. Davis said, his voice barely above a whisper. Harnessing energies that were previously unknown to science. They believed they could create a sonar system that could penetrate anything, see anything, anywhere. Sarah stared at him, her mind struggling to grasp the implications of what he was saying. Manipulating reality? Harnessing unknown energies? It sounded like something out of a science fiction movie, not a top-secret government project. And this system, Emily interjected, her voice tight with concern. It's still down there, isn't it? Mr. Davis nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. As far as I know, yes. The project was abandoned, deemed too dangerous, too unstable. But the equipment, the technology, it's all still down there at the bottom of the lake. But why? Why leave it there? Sarah asked, her voice rising in frustration. Why not retrieve it, dismantle it, make sure it can't be used again? Mr. Davis sighed, a weary sound that spoke of years of regret and unanswered questions. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The official explanation was that it was too risky, too expensive to retrieve. The technology was too delicate, the depths too treacherous. But I suspect there was more to it than that. I suspect that some people, somewhere, wanted it to stay there, as a fail-safe perhaps, or maybe as a bargaining chip. The boat fell silent once more, the weight of Mr. Davis's words hanging heavy in the air. The shimmering surface of Lake Tahoe seemed to mock them, its beauty masking the dark secrets that lay hidden beneath. So what do we do? Emily finally asked, breaking the silence. We can't just leave it there, knowing what it's capable of. Mr. Davis looked at them, his eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. That's up to you, he said. I've told you what I know. I've shown you the evidence. Now it's your decision. Will you expose the truth, risk the consequences, or will you let the secret of Lake Tahoe remain buried forever? Sarah and Emily exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. They knew that they couldn't turn their backs on this, not after everything they had learned. The fate of Lake Tahoe, and perhaps something more, rested on their shoulders. We'll do everything we can, Sarah said, her voice firm and resolute. We'll expose the truth, no matter the cost. Emily nodded in agreement, her eyes blazing with determination. We owe it to the lake, to the community, to ourselves. Mr. Davis smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. I knew I could count on you, he said, but be careful. You're dealing with powerful forces, forces that will stop at nothing to protect their secrets. "We're ready," Sarah said, her voice filled with a newfound courage. "We're ready for anything." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lake, Sarah and Emily knew that their lives would never be the same. They had stumbled upon a secret that had been hidden for over 70 years, a secret that threatened to unravel the very fabric of reality. And they were determined to expose it, no matter the consequences. But little did they know that the forces they were about to confront were far more dangerous, far more ruthless than they could ever have imagined. The journey ahead would be fraught with peril, filled with twists and turns, and would test their courage, their loyalty, and their very sanity. The secret of Lake Tahoe was about to be revealed. But at what cost? The answer, they suspected, lay hidden in the depths, waiting to be discovered. And the clock was ticking. They had to act fast before it was too late, before the secret of Lake Tahoe consumed them all. The lake was beautiful, serene, but beneath its surface, darkness stirred, a darkness that had been dormant for decades, waiting for its moment to awaken. And that moment, they feared, was fast approaching. The game had begun, and the stakes were higher than they could ever have imagined. The air in the cabin crackled with tension. Sheriff Brody stared at the faded photograph, the faces of the original team staring back at him, their eyes filled with a mixture of determination and a chilling fear. He could almost hear their voices, echoing from the past, warning him, pleading with him to stop. But he couldn't. He was too far in. "What do you think they found, Sheriff?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. The flickering candlelight danced across her face, highlighting the worry etched into her features. Brody sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I wish I knew, Sarah. I wish I knew. Whatever it was enough to drive them mad, to make them abandon their mission, to bury it all and pretend it never happened." "But why?" Ben interjected, leaning forward. "Why keep it a secret for so long? Why not tell someone? Anyone?" "That's what I can't figure out," Brody admitted. Unless it was something they couldn't tell anyone. Something so unbelievable, so terrifying, that they were afraid no one would believe them. Or worse, that someone would try to exploit it. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and the cabin seemed to groan under the pressure. Sarah shivered, pulling her sweater tighter around her. "This place is giving me the creeps," she said. "Can we at least try to get some sleep? We have a long day ahead of us tomorrow." Brody nodded, though he knew sleep would be elusive. He extinguished the candle, plunging the cabin into darkness. The only light came from the moon, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. He lay in his sleeping bag, his mind racing, trying to piece together the puzzle. What had those men seen? What had they discovered in the depths of Lake Tahoe that had driven them to such extremes? He thought about the stories he had heard as a child, the legends of the Washoe tribe, the ancient spirits that were said to inhabit the lake. Could there be some truth to those stories? Could there be something supernatural lurking beneath the surface? He dismissed the thought as quickly as it came. He was a lawman, a man of science. He didn't believe in ghosts or monsters, but he couldn't deny the strange feeling he had, the sense of unease that had been growing stronger ever since he had started this investigation. The next morning, they prepared for their dive. The sun was shining, but the air was crisp and cold. As they loaded their gear onto the boat, Brody couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just the trees, the mountains, and the vast expanse of the lake. "Ready to go, Sheriff?" Ben asked, giving him a reassuring smile. Brody forced a smile in return. "Ready as I'll ever be," he said. They motored out to the coordinates they had marked the day before, the spot where the anomaly had been detected. The water was even more crystalline here, the bottom visible for what seemed like a dizzying depth. Brody felt a familiar mix of excitement and trepidation. He was a man of the land, not the water, but he knew that sometimes the greatest secrets were hidden beneath the surface. As they geared up, Emily ran through the dive plan one last time. "Remember, we stick together. If we see anything unusual, anything that makes us uncomfortable, we abort the dive immediately. No heroics. Understood?" Brody and Ben both nodded. They knew the risks. They knew that they were venturing into the unknown. But they also knew that they had to find out what was down there. The fate of Lake Tahoe, and perhaps more, might depend on it. They slipped into the water, the cold shocking their systems. Brody gasped, his breath catching in his throat. But the cold quickly subsided as he focused on his breathing, on equalizing the pressure in his ears. He descended slowly, following Emily and Ben, the sunlight fading as they went deeper. The underwater world was both beautiful and eerie. Schools of fish darted past, their scales shimmering in the filtered light. Giant boulders loomed like ancient monuments, covered in a layer of algae. And then they reached the anomaly. It was a structure of some kind, but unlike anything Brody had ever seen. It was made of a dark metallic material, its surface smooth and seamless. It was roughly spherical, about the size of a small car, and it seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible vibration. Emily signaled for them to approach cautiously. They swam closer, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they got closer, Brody noticed something strange. The water around the sphere seemed to distort, as if the very fabric of reality was being warped. He reached out a hand, hesitating for a moment before touching the surface of the sphere. As his fingers made contact, a jolt of energy surged through his body. He felt a tingling sensation, a strange sense of disorientation. He quickly pulled his hand back, shaking his head. "Did you feel that?" he asked, his voice muffled by his regulator. Emily nodded, her eyes wide with concern. "Yes, something is definitely not right here." Ben, who had been circling the sphere, suddenly stopped and pointed. "Look," he exclaimed, his voice urgent. Brody and Emily followed his gaze. On the far side of the sphere, a section of the surface seemed to shimmer and fade, revealing a doorway into the unknown. A beam of light emanated from the doorway, illuminating the dark depths of the lake. It was a mesmerizing sight, but also deeply unsettling. What was inside? What secrets did this strange object hold? Emily consulted her dive computer. "We're running low on air," she signaled. "We need to go back." Brody hesitated. He wanted to explore, to find out what was inside the sphere. But he knew that Emily was right. They were pushing their limits. They had to be smart. He nodded in agreement. They turned to ascend, but as they did, the doorway in the sphere began to close. Faster and faster until it was completely sealed. And then the sphere vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, as if it had never existed at all. Brody stared in disbelief. Had they imagined it? Had the pressure, the cold, the stress finally gotten to them? But he knew that they hadn't. They had seen something real, something extraordinary, something that defied explanation. They surfaced, the bright sunlight blinding them for a moment. They climbed back onto the boat, their bodies shaken with cold and adrenaline. "What the hell was that?" Ben asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Emily said, her brow furrowed. "But I think we just opened a Pandora's box." Brody remained silent, staring back at the spot where the sphere had been. He knew that this was just the beginning, that they had stumbled upon something far bigger, far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. Back on shore, they huddled in Emily's cabin, reviewing the dive footage and comparing notes. The video was grainy and distorted, but it clearly showed the sphere, the doorway, and the strange energy emanating from it. "We need to show this to someone," Ben said. "Someone who can help us understand what we're dealing with." Emily shook her head. "Who would believe us? They'd think we were crazy." "But we can't just ignore this," Brody said. "Whatever that thing was, it's still out there, and it could be a threat to the lake, to the world." They debated for hours, weighing the risks and benefits of going public with their discovery. Finally, they reached a decision. They would contact someone they trusted, someone who had the resources and the expertise to investigate further. They decided to call Dr. Albright, the marine biologist who had first alerted them to the anomaly. She was a respected scientist, and she had a reputation for being open-minded and objective. They reached her at her research facility in Monterey. She listened patiently to their story, her voice betraying no emotion. "I understand what you're saying," she said when they had finished, "and I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. I will look into it." Brody felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't alone in this. Maybe Dr. Albright could help them unravel the mystery of the sphere. But as he hung up the phone, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still walking a very dangerous path. A path that could lead them to the truth, or to something far worse. The next few days were filled with anticipation and anxiety. They waited for Dr. Albright to call back to give them some answers, but the phone remained silent. Brody found himself increasingly preoccupied, unable to focus on his work. He spent hours staring at the lake, wondering what secrets it held. He felt a growing sense of unease, a premonition that something terrible was about to happen. One evening, as he was driving home from work, he noticed a car following him. It was a black sedan, its windows tinted. He tried to shake it off, but it stayed on his tail, matching his every move. He felt a surge of panic. Was he being watched? Were they closing in? He decided to take a detour, turning down a winding mountain road. The black sedan followed him. He sped up, pushing his truck to its limits. The sedan stayed right behind him, its headlights glaring in his rearview mirror. He realized that he was being chased, and that whoever was chasing him meant him harm. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He wasn't going to let them catch him. He wasn't going to let them silence him. He had to protect the lake and the truth, no matter the cost. He slammed on the gas, the truck roaring as it climbed the steep incline. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The black sedan was still there, gaining ground. He knew he could outrun them. He had to find a way to lose them. He spotted a narrow dirt road leading off to the side. It was overgrown with trees and bushes, barely visible in the fading light. He made a split-second decision. He swerved sharply, turning onto the dirt road. The truck bounced and jolted as it navigated the rough terrain. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The black sedan had missed the turn. It skidded to a halt, its tires screeching. He breathed a sigh of relief. He had lost them, for now, but he knew that they would be back, and that he was running out of time. He had to find a way to expose the truth before it was too late. He drove deeper into the forest, the truck rattling and shaking. He needed a place to hide, a place to think, a place to plan his next move. He finally came to a small clearing, hidden deep in the woods. He parked the truck, turned off the engine, and stepped out into the silence. He looked up at the stars, twinkling in the night sky. He felt a sense of loneliness, a sense of isolation. He was all alone, fighting a battle that no one else even knew existed. But he knew that he couldn't give up. He had to keep fighting. For the lake, for the truth, for himself. As he stood there, gazing at the stars, he heard a twig snap behind him. He whirled around, his hand instinctively reaching for the Glock holstered at his hip. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing through the trees. Silence. He waited, every muscle tense, his senses on high alert. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the only sound a gentle rustling of leaves in the night breeze. He scanned the darkness, his eyes straining to penetrate the shadows. "I know you're there," he said, his voice firm. "Show yourself." A figure emerged from the trees, stepping into the faint moonlight. It was Emily. "Emily, what are you doing here?" Brody asked, lowering his hand from his gun. "I followed you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I had to know where you were going." Brody sighed. "It's not safe here, Emily. You shouldn't have come." "I couldn't let you do this alone," she said, her eyes pleading. "I know what you're up against, Brody, and I want to help." He looked at her, his expression softening. He knew he couldn't send her back. Not now, not when he needed all the help he could get. "All right," he said, "but you have to promise me you'll do exactly as I say. No questions asked." Emily nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I promise." Brody turned and started walking towards a small, unassuming shed hidden amongst the trees. "Come on," he said. "We have work to do." Inside the shed, Brody revealed a hidden cache of equipment, high-powered sonar devices, underwater cameras, and a small, remotely operated vehicle, ROV. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with a grim resolve. "This is how we're going to find out what's really going on down there." Emily stared at the equipment, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "Are you sure about this, Brody?" she asked. "This is a dangerous game we're playing." "I know," he said, "but it's a game we have to play for the lake, for the truth." He spent the next few hours meticulously preparing the equipment, explaining to Emily how each device worked. He showed her how to operate the sonar, how to control the ROV, how to interpret the data they would be collecting. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, they loaded the equipment into Brody's truck and drove towards the lake. They launched the boat, the same one they had used to explore the anomaly, and headed towards the coordinates Brody had marked. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting a golden glow over the lake. The water was calm and still, reflecting the surrounding mountains like a mirror. But beneath the surface, Brody knew a storm was brewing. They reached the designated spot and Brody cut the engine. The boat drifted silently underwater, the only sound, the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. All right, Brody said, his voice low and serious. Let's do this. He deployed the sonar device, its pinging sound cutting through the silence. Emily monitored the readings, her eyes glued to the screen. I'm getting something, she said, her voice hushed. A large object about 100 meters down. Brody's heart skipped a beat. Can you get a visual? Emily adjusted the settings on the sonar. I'm trying, she said, but the image is distorted. There's something interfering with the signal. Brody frowned. Interfering? What do you mean? I don't know, Emily said. It's like there's a field of energy around the object. It's scrambling the sonar readings. Brody's mind raced. A field of energy? What could possibly be creating that? All right, he said. Let's deploy the ROV. I want to see what's down there. He lowered the ROV into the water, its camera transmitting a live feed to a monitor on the boat. The ROV descended slowly, the light from its headlights cutting through the darkness. As the ROV reached a depth of 100 meters, the image on the monitor began to clear. And then they saw it. A massive structure unlike anything they had ever seen before. It was made of a dark metallic material and it was shaped like a pyramid. It was enormous, dwarfing the ROV. Brody and Emily stared at the monitor in stunned silence. They had found it. They had found the thing that had been hidden beneath the surface of Lake Tahoe for so long. But as they gazed at the mysterious structure, a sudden surge of energy erupted from it, engulfing the ROV in a blinding flash of light. The monitor went blank. What was that? Emily gasped, her voice filled with fear. Brody stared at the blank screen, his mind reeling. He didn't know what had just happened, but he knew one thing. They had just awakened something ancient and powerful. And it was not happy. We've lost contact, Brody shouted, frantically tapping at the controls. The ROV feed remained stubbornly black. Static hissed from the speakers, a chilling counterpoint to the frantic beating of his heart. Try rebooting the system, Emily. Now! Emily, her face pale, hammered at the keyboard. The small cabin of the research vessel felt suddenly cramped, the air thick with tension. Rebooting. Come on, come on. Minutes stretched into an eternity as they waited, the silence broken only by the hum of the generator and the rhythmic lapping of waves against the hull. Finally, the monitor flickered back to life, displaying the familiar Windows loading screen. It's coming back online, Emily exclaimed, relief flooding her voice. The ROV feed reappeared, but the image was distorted, grainy and filled with static. The camera panned wildly, as if the ROV was struggling to regain its bearings. Something's interfering with the signal, Brody muttered, his eyes glued to the screen. I can barely make anything out. Through the static, they could just make out the structure again. It was still there, looming in the darkness, but it looked different. The smooth, metallic surface seemed to pulse with an inner light, and strange symbols, previously invisible, now glowed with an eerie luminescence. Those symbols, I've never seen anything like them, Emily whispered, her voice trembling. They look almost alive. Suddenly, the ROV lurched violently, throwing the image on the screen into chaos. A high-pitched whine filled the cabin, followed by a series of loud cracks. What's happening? Emily cried, grabbing onto the console for support. I don't know, Brody yelled back, struggling to maintain control of the ROV. It's like something's attacking it. The ROV feed went completely haywire, displaying a jumbled mess of colors and shapes. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. The image stabilized, revealing a clear, unobstructed view of the structure. But this time, it was different. The structure was no longer static. It was moving, slowly rotating in the water. And from its depths, a beam of intense blue light shot out, piercing through the darkness and heading directly towards the surface. "Brody, look!" Emily screamed, pointing at the monitor. "What is that light?" Brody stared in disbelief as the beam of light continued to ascend, growing brighter and more intense with each passing second. He knew with a chilling certainty that whatever was happening beneath the surface of Lake Tahoe was about to change everything. He grabbed the radio. "This is Research Vessel Sierra, calling for immediate assistance. We have a situation at Lake Tahoe. Repeat, we have a situation. We need immediate evacuation." Static crackled in response. "Sierra, this is dispatch. Please state the nature of your emergency." "I don't have time to explain. Just get here. Now. Something's happening. Something big." Brody yelled into the radio, his voice strained with urgency. He knew that time was running out, that whatever was about to happen would happen fast. He looked back at the shimmering anomaly, its light now almost blinding. Sarah and Emily emerged from the cabin, their faces etched with concern. "What's going on, Brody?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Get below deck, now," Brody ordered, his voice firm. "Something's about to happen, and I don't want you two anywhere near it." Emily hesitated, her eyes fixed on the glowing anomaly. "But what is it?" "I don't know," Brody snapped. "And I don't have time to explain. Just get below deck and stay there until I tell you it's safe." Reluctantly, Sarah and Emily retreated to the cabin, their eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Brody watched them go, then turned his attention back to the anomaly. The light was now so intense that it was almost painful to look at. He shielded his eyes with his hand, trying to make out what was happening beneath the surface of the water. Suddenly, the water began to churn and bubble as if something massive was rising from the depths. The boat rocked violently, throwing Brody off balance. He grabbed onto the railing, struggling to stay on his feet. The air crackled with energy, and the smell of ozone filled the air. Then, with a deafening roar, a column of water erupted from the lake, reaching high into the sky. The water was laced with streaks of blue and green energy, and at the center of the column, Brody could see something. Something impossible. It was a structure, a massive, geometric structure made of a material that he couldn't identify. It shimmered and pulsed with energy, its surface covered in intricate patterns and symbols. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before, something that defied all known laws of physics. Brody stared in disbelief, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. This was it, the thing they had been searching for, the thing that had been hidden beneath the surface of Lake Tahoe for so long. But what was it? And what was it doing? As the column of water began to subside, the structure settled back into the lake, its shimmering surface still visible beneath the water. The energy around it seemed to dissipate, leaving behind an eerie silence. The boat rocked gently on the water, the only sound the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. Brody stood there, frozen in place, his mind reeling from what he had just witnessed. He knew that everything had changed, that the world would never be the same again. He had seen something that was not meant to be seen, something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about reality. He slowly lowered his hand from his eyes, his gaze fixed on the spot where the structure had disappeared beneath the surface. He knew that he had to tell someone, that he couldn't keep this a secret. But who would believe him? And what would they do with this information? He turned and walked slowly towards the cabin, his mind racing. He had to protect Sarah and Emily. He had to get them out of here. But he also knew that he couldn't just walk away, that he had a responsibility to understand what he had seen. He reached the cabin door and hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. He took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping inside. Sarah and Emily were waiting for him, their faces pale with fear. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Brody looked at them, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "I don't know," he said, "but I think we're about to find out." He knew that the events of the next few hours, the next few days, would determine the fate of Lake Tahoe, and perhaps even the fate of the world. The secret that had been hidden beneath the surface for so long had finally been revealed, and now they had to face the consequences. The silence of the lake was broken only by their breathing, the anticipation hanging heavy in the air, like the calm before a storm that threatened to engulf everything they knew. The weight of the unknown pressed down on them, a tangible force that promised to reshape their reality. "But where do we even begin?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 70 years. That's a lifetime of secrets. "We start with what we know," Ben replied, his gaze fixed on the shimmering water. "The anomaly, the energy readings, the old journals, they all point to something specific, something located deep within the lake." "But deep, how deep, Ben?" "Tahoe's bottom is a labyrinth," Mark interjected, his brow furrowed with concern. "We could spend weeks down there and find nothing but silt and ancient trees." Ben pulled out the waterproof tablet, bringing up the sonar scans they had gathered over the past few months. "Remember the readings we got near Emerald Bay? The ones that showed a distinct structure, almost artificial, at a depth of nearly 1,600 feet. Sarah leaned closer, examining the image. The readings were dismissed as geological anomalies, some sort of unusual rock formation. "That's what they wanted us to think," Ben said, a hint of steel in his voice. "But I never bought it. The shape, the energy signature. It's too precise, too organized to be natural." "So you're saying there's something built down there?" Mark asked, his eyes widening. "Something man-made?" "Or something not man-made," Ben corrected, his gaze drifting towards the distant mountains. "Something else." He tapped the screen, bringing up a magnified view of the sonar image. "Look at the angles, the symmetry. This isn't just a random pile of rocks. This is a structure, and it's emitting a powerful energy field, one that's been growing steadily over the past few years." "But what kind of structure could withstand that kind of pressure?" Sarah questioned, her voice filled with disbelief. "And what could it possibly be doing down there?" "Those are the questions we're about to answer," Ben said, turning to face them. "We gear up, we dive, and we find out what's hidden beneath the surface." The next few hours were a flurry of activity. They prepped their diving equipment, double-checking every regulator, every tank, every seal. The weight of the mission hung heavy in the air, a tangible burden that settled on their shoulders. They knew that this was no ordinary dive. This was a descent into the unknown, a journey into the heart of the mystery that had remained unsolved for generations. As they suited up, Ben recounted some of the journal entries he'd uncovered. One of the old-timers, a man named Silas, wrote about strange lights emanating from the lake at night, about whispers carried on the wind, about a feeling of being watched by something unseen. Superstitions, Mark scoffed, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Old wives' tales. Maybe, Ben conceded, but Silas wasn't alone. Other accounts speak of similar phenomena, of unexplained disappearances, of a sense of unease that permeates the area around Emerald Bay. They all point to something different. The submersible, christened Deep Explorer, was a marvel of engineering, designed to withstand immense pressure and equipped with state-of-the-art sonar, cameras, and manipulator arms. As they descended, the sunlight gradually faded, replaced by the eerie glow of the submersible's powerful lights. The water grew colder, the pressure more intense. Depth 500 feet, Mark announced, his voice calm and professional. All systems nominal. Keep an eye on the sonar, Ben instructed, his gaze fixed on the monitors displaying the lakebed. That anomaly could be anything. We need to be ready for it. They continued their descent, the darkness deepening, the silence broken only by the hum of the submersible machinery and the crackle of static on the comms. At 1,000 feet, the lakebed came into view, a desolate landscape of rock, sediment, and the occasional skeletal remains of long-dead trees. "Anything?" Ben asked, his voice tight with anticipation. "Nothing yet," Mark replied, his eyes scanning the sonar readings. "Just the usual geological formations. Wait, I'm picking up something. A large metallic object. It's buried in the sediment." "Coordinates." Mark rattled off the numbers, and Ben immediately cross-referenced them with the coordinates from the old map. "That's it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "That's the location of the anomaly." They maneuvered the submersible closer, the powerful lights illuminating the object buried in the sediment. It was huge, far larger than they had anticipated, a massive, cylindrical structure of some kind, its surface covered in a thick layer of silt and algae. "What is that thing?" Mark breathed, his voice filled with awe. "I don't know," Ben said, his mind racing, "but I have a feeling we're about to find out." Using the manipulator arms, they began to clear away the sediment, slowly revealing the object beneath. As more and more of it was exposed, they began to make out details. Strange symbols etched into the metal, intricate patterns that seemed to defy any known language or culture. "This isn't of this world," Mark said, his voice trembling slightly. Suddenly, the submersible shuddered violently. Alarms blared, red lights flashed, and the monitors went haywire. "What's happening?" Ben yelled, struggling to regain control of the submersible. "I don't know," Mark shouted back, his hands flying across the controls. "We're losing power. Something's interfering with our systems." The submersible continued to shake, the lights flickering erratically. Outside, the water seemed to swirl and churn as if something massive was moving around them. "We need to get out of here," Ben shouted. "Now!" But it was too late. A blinding light filled the submersible, and then everything went black. Sarah and Emily waited anxiously on the surface, their eyes glued to the monitors displaying the submersible's vital signs. The minutes stretched into an eternity, the silence broken only by the sound of the waves lapping against the hull of the research vessel. "They should have reported in by now," Emily said, her voice tight with worry. "Something's wrong." Suddenly the monitors flickered and then went blank. All communication with the submersible was lost. "No," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with horror. "No, this can't be happening." Just then, the water around the research vessel began to churn violently. A massive whirlpool formed, sucking everything towards its center. The vessel rocked and rolled, tossed about like a toy in a bathtub. "What in God's name is that?" Emily screamed, clinging to the railing for dear life. Then, from the depths of the lake, something rose. Something huge, something ancient, something alien. It was a colossal structure of metal and light, its surface covered in intricate patterns and glowing symbols. It dwarfed the research vessel, casting a long, ominous shadow across the water. Sarah stared in disbelief, her mind unable to comprehend what she was seeing. The legends were true. The stories were real. There was something hidden beneath the surface of Lake Tahoe, something that had been kept secret for centuries. And now it had awakened. The structure emitted a powerful energy pulse, a wave of pure force that washed over the research vessel. Everything went silent. Everything went still. And then everything disappeared. Years later, Lake Tahoe remained as beautiful and enigmatic as ever. The disappearances of the research vessel, the submersible, and its crew were never solved. The official explanation was a freak accident, a rare combination of natural phenomena that had claimed the lives of those on board. But some knew the truth. They knew that there was something else at play, something far more sinister and profound. They knew that Lake Tahoe held a secret that some would go to any length to protect. And so the secret remained buried deep beneath the surface of the lake, waiting for the day when it would be awakened once more. The whispers carried on the wind, the strange lights emanating from the water, the feeling of being watched. They were all still there, a constant reminder of the ancient power that lay dormant beneath the waves. The lake continued to guard its secrets, its depths concealing a truth that humanity may never be ready to face. The serenity of the surface belied the chaotic reality hidden below, a silent testament to the forces that shaped not only the lake, but perhaps the very fabric of our reality. And those who knew the truth could only watch and wait, hoping that the slumber would last, that the depths would continue to keep their silence. The fate of Lake Tahoe, and perhaps the world, hung precariously in the balance, suspended between the known and the unknown, between the real and the unreal. The mystery endured, a chilling reminder that some secrets are best left undisturbed, that some depths are best left unexplored. The lake held its breath, waiting. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe. Comment what you want to hear next. The silence, however, couldn't last forever. Whispers began to circulate amongst the old families, the ones who had lived on the shores for generations. They spoke of strange occurrences, of tremors felt deep beneath the surface, of unsettling changes in the lake's normally pristine clarity. Fishermen reported catches of fish unlike any they had ever seen, grotesque and bioluminescent, creatures that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Then came the disappearances, boats, vanishing without a trace, hikers wandering into the woods never to return, their fates swallowed by the vast wilderness surrounding the lake. Sheriff Brody, a man hardened by years of small-town policing, initially dismissed the stories as folklore, as the ramblings of over-imaginative locals. But the evidence began to mount, undeniable and chilling. He found the abandoned boat drifting near Emerald Bay. No sign of the occupants, only a faint metallic scent lingering in the air. He interviewed the distraught families of the missing hikers, listening to their tales of unease and premonition. He started to believe, a cold dread creeping into his heart. He knew something was terribly wrong with Lake Tahoe. "This isn't a bear attack, Martha," he told his deputy, his voice grim. "This is something different."